A heavy silence enveloped the night, thick and all-encompassing, as though the world itself had paused to listen. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock sliced through the stillness, each chime resonating softly in the quiet house. Outside, the branches of trees brushed against the window, their gentle swaying adding a subtle rhythm to the calm. I sank deeper into the worn embrace of the sofa, its familiar lumps and faded fabric offering an odd sense of comfort. A book rested in my hand, its pages half-turned, though I hadn't truly read a word in a while. In my other hand, a cup of chamomile tea exuded warmth, its fragrant steam rising in delicate spirals. My thoughts meandered, like loose threads pulled from a tightly knit sweater, eluding my attempts to focus. Absently, I slipped my free hand into the deep pocket of my robe, fingers brushing against the fabric as I searched for nothing in particular, a stray tissue, a forgotten trinket. My hand paused, caught in the aimless drift of my mind. The silence seemed to intensify the weight of my thoughts, and for a moment, I allowed myself to wander into fantasies, lives never lived, paths never taken. Just as I was about to pull myself back to the present, a knock at the door shattered the quiet. It wasn't a hesitant sound like a branch scraping against the house. It was firm, deliberate, unmistakably human. My heart skipped, the rhythm of my thoughts fractured like glass shattering on tile. Who could it be at this hour? I placed the tea gently on the coffee table, the porcelain making a soft clink against the wood, and rose from the sofa. My steps were slow and cautious, the plush rug muffling my movements as I neared the door. A chill crept up my spine, not just from the draft that seeped through the old frame. Peering through the peephole, I squinted to make out the figure standing in the dim porch light. It was Vince. Even through the distorted glass, I recognized him immediately. My older brother stood there, his broad shoulders stiff, his posture rigid, as though he were holding himself together with sheer will. The light cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines of worry etched into his features. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the lock. This wasn't like him. Vincent never showed up unannounced, much less at this hour. I cracked the door open just enough to see him more clearly. "Vincent," I whispered, my voice carrying the kind of softness meant for fragile moments. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" He didn't answer immediately. His breath billowed in the cold air as he stood there, hands jammed deep into his coat pockets. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, unsteady, tinged with something that sent a ripple of unease through me. "I'm sorry it's so late," he said. I didn't know where else to go." Concern swept over me in an instant, dispelling the remnants of my earlier musings. I opened the door wider, motioning for him to come in. "Come in," I urged, my voice firm despite the knot tightening in my chest. "It's freezing out there." Vincent stepped across the threshold, his movements deliberate, as though each step required more effort than usual. He shrugged off his coat, pausing for a moment before hanging it on the rack by the door. His shoulders remained tense, his frame hunched in a way I had never seen before. It was unsettling, seeing him like this, the man who had always been my rock, my steadfast older brother, now appearing so defeated. I led him to the living room, gesturing toward the sofa. He sank onto the edge of it, his hands tightly clasped between his knees, his gaze fixed on some point on the floor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The room felt smaller, the weight of unspoken words pressing against the walls. "Would you like some tea?" I offered the question gently, breaking the heavy silence. My own cup of tea sat forgotten on the table, its warmth gradually fading away. He shook his head, a barely noticeable movement. "No, thank you," he muttered, his voice rough. I positioned myself across from him, drawing a chair closer to the couch. My gaze lingered on his face, following the lines of exhaustion and something deeper, perhaps pain or regret. "Vincent," I spoke softly, my voice carrying the weight of concern. "What's going on?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the sound heavy in the quiet room. "Things have been tough," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who else to talk to. His words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, like a bridge hovering over an abyss. I waited, giving him the space he needed to gather his thoughts. Vincent had always been the strong one, the one who silently bore the weight of the world. For him to show up like this, unannounced and visibly shaken, signaled that something had cracked beneath the surface. "Take your time," I said gently, folding my hands in my lap. "Whatever it is, you're not alone." He gave a faint nod, still not looking up, his gaze fixed on the floor. The steady ticking of the old clock in the background reminded us that time continued to move forward, even as we were suspended in this moment. I wanted to reach out, to offer some reassurance through touch, but his posture held me back, keeping me in place. The silence stretched on, and I couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to my door in the dead of night. Whatever it was, it had to be something significant, something powerful enough to fracture the carefully constructed facade Vincent usually wore. I sat quietly, letting the space between us fill with the weight of unspoken things. The silence lingered, heavy with what wasn't being said. Vincent sat rigid on the edge of the sofa, his hands tightly clasped together, knuckles pale. His breathing was shallow, deliberate, as though each breath took conscious effort. For a moment, I feared he wouldn't speak at all, that he would retreat into his quiet reserve and leave me to wonder about the storm raging inside him. But finally he spoke. "I've been putting too much on myself," he confessed, his voice thick, as if the words themselves resisted being spoken. "The loneliness, the stress, it's been building up. You were always the only person who listened without judgment." The words hit me harder than I anticipated. Vincent had always been the one with the answers, the one who silently shouldered burdens, never admitting to them, as if acknowledging them would diminish his strength. To hear him so open, so raw, felt like watching a fortress crumble. "I had no idea," I whispered, a twinge of guilt gnawing at me. "When was the last time we really talked?" Not the usual surface-level conversations about work or the occasional family memory, but something real, something that peeled back the layers and left you vulnerable. He paused, his expression shifting as he looked at me for the first time, the weight of his emotions clear. "Too long," he admitted quietly. "I didn't want you to know." He leaned forward, his elbows bracing on his knees, his voice almost lost in the vulnerability of the moment. "I thought I could handle it," he murmured, shaking his head. His jaw tightened, and before he could finish his thought, the words hung suspended in the air. I stayed quiet, allowing him the time to untangle the mess of thoughts he was carrying. "It's like I'm watching life slip through my fingers," he finally said, his voice low. "The things I used to take for granted just don't feel the same anymore. The family looks to me to hold everything together, but some days, I don't even know if I can hold myself together." His vulnerability struck me like a sharp pang. Vincent had always been the strong one, the one who stepped in when things went wrong. It was easy to forget that even the strongest foundations can crack, that beneath his composed exterior, he harbored the same fears and doubts we all did. "I know that feeling," I replied softly, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes briefly met mine, and for the first time that night, I saw something in them, a flicker of relief, as if hearing those words lightened the weight he carried, even if just a little. The conversation started to flow more easily, at first halting, like water breaking through a dam. He spoke of the fear that accompanied aging, the relentless passage of time, leaving him uncertain of what he had truly accomplished and what still lay ahead. He talked about the pressure of maintaining his role in the family, the quiet anchor that everyone relied on but never thought to check on. And then there was the ache of loneliness, an emptiness he couldn't fully name, but that clung to him all the same. "I didn't think it would feel like this," he admitted after a long pause. "Getting older, I thought I'd have everything figured out by now." "None of us do," I said gently. "We just pretend we do, so no one realizes we're just as lost as they are." He let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking his head. You've always been better at putting these things into words. I shrugged, a faint smile tugging at my lips. That doesn't mean I have the answers. We talked for hours, the ebb and flow of conversation punctuated by moments of quiet reflection. Memories surfaced, unbidden but welcomed. Summer spent fishing at the lake, childhood pranks, the time we stayed up all night catching fireflies only to release them at dawn. There was a lightness to those memories that softened the heaviness of the present. Sometimes, we simply sat in companionable silence, the ticking of the clock filling the gaps between words. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, the kind that spoke of trust and understanding. The old clock chimed softly, its notes echoing through the room. I glanced at it, surprised to see how late it had gotten, midnight. Time had slipped away from us unnoticed, just as it always did. I should probably go home, Vincent murmured, though he didn't make any move to rise. His voice was quieter now, softer, as if the act of sharing had drained him, but left him somehow lighter. I stood first, crossing the short distance between us. "You don't have to carry this alone," I said, my hand resting gently on his shoulder. My voice was steady, but there was warmth in it, mirroring the concern I felt in my chest. "You've always been there for everyone else. Let someone be there for you." His eyes met mine, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. In that silence, I saw gratitude, unspoken, yet palpable. He nodded slowly, and as he stood, his hand brushed against mine. A simple, fleeting touch, but in that moment, it felt like an unspoken promise. "Thank you," he whispered, "for listening, for being here." He left quietly, the door clicking softly shut behind him. I stood in the entryway for a while longer, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The air felt different somehow, as if the weight of the night had shifted. In the days that followed, we found ourselves reaching out more often. Calls that began with simple check-ins but grew into long conversations. Visits that ended with promises to see each other again soon. That late-night knock had opened something between us, something deeper, more enduring. As I returned to my book and my now cold tea, I realized that sometimes all it takes is letting someone in. After all, family is where we find our way back to ourselves.